What would you do if one day, without warning, someone stood on your doorstep and told you that the home you had lived in for decades was no longer yours? It started with a knock. Soft at first, almost uncertain, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to go through with what they were about to do. Then, another. Harder. More forceful. The kind of knock that demanded attention, the kind that signaled trouble. Walter, sitting alone in his living room, felt it before he even stood up. A deep, unsettling shift in the air. He had lived in this house for over 30 years, knew every creak in the floorboards, every crack in the walls, every shift in the seasons. He had always followed the rules, paid his dues, kept to himself. Yet, somehow, he knew, this knock wasn't friendly. With a steady hand, Walter reached for his cane and rose to his feet, making his way toward the door. He didn't need to see to understand what was coming. The HOA had been after him for weeks, nitpicking at meaningless infractions, sending letters filled with demands that made no sense. He had ignored them. He knew better. He knew the rules, had followed them religiously since the day he moved in. But something had changed. Something was different this time. As the door swung open, the sharp morning sunlight hit Walter's face, momentarily disorienting him in a way his blindness never could. And then, there she was. Karen. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, standing like she owned not just his house, but the entire neighborhood. Her posture was stiff, authoritative, lips pursed in a way that Walter could hear even without seeing. And behind her, the real reason for the heavy knock, two uniformed officers, standing with arms crossed, their silence just as ominous as Karen's presence. "Walter," Karen said, voice syrupy sweet, like a poison hidden in honey. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news." Even before she spoke the words, he knew what was coming. "You're being evicted." The words hung in the air, foreign, absurd, impossible. Walter tightened his grip on his cane, steadying himself as the world around him seemed to shift. Evicted. From his own home. He wasn't some careless tenant behind on his rent. This was his house. He had built a life here, a safe space in a world that didn't always accommodate him. And now they were trying to take it away. Karen spoke again, but Walter barely registered her words. His mind was already racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. This wasn't about property codes. This wasn't about an untrimmed lawn or an outdated fence color. This was something more. Something calculated. For the first time in years, Walter felt it, that deep, instinctive awareness that he was under attack. And if they thought he would just roll over and let them take everything from him, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Walter stood frozen for a moment, his grip tightening around his cane as Karen's words sank in. Evicted. The word itself felt unreal, detached from the life he had built in this home. He steadied himself, pushing past the initial shock, his mind sharpening as he listened to Karen's self-satisfied tone. She was enjoying this. That much was clear. "You have until the end of the week to vacate," she continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The HOA has determined your property is in serious violation of community standards. We've given you ample time to comply, and unfortunately, we can't allow the neighborhood's integrity to be compromised." Walter clenched his jaw. He had heard enough. Integrity. That word coming from Karen was almost laughable. He had lived here longer than most of the board members combined. He had followed every rule, every guideline, and yet, suddenly, he was a problem. No, this wasn't about community standards. This was something else. Something personal. Karen lingered, waiting for a reaction, for him to protest or plead. But Walter had spent his life navigating a world that underestimated him. He knew when to hold his tongue, when to let silence work in his favor. He let the tension stretch between them, let the weight of his unspoken defiance settle in the air. Finally, Karen let out a sharp breath, clearly annoyed by his lack of response. "You can fight this, Walter," she said, feigning concern, "but honestly, it would be easier for everyone if you just cooperate. I'd hate for things to get messy." And there it was. The veiled threat. The final push to make him fold. But instead of fear, something else stirred inside Walter. A slow-burning anger. He had spent his life adapting, finding ways to exist in a world that wasn't designed for him. And he had done it with dignity, with patience. But this was different. Without another word, he stepped back and shut the door in Karen's face. As soon as the latch clicked into place, Walter took a deep breath, centering himself. He needed answers. If Karen thought she could strong-arm him into submission, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. He moved swiftly, his fingers tracing along the bookshelf until they found the smooth, familiar shape of his phone. His hands worked from muscle memory, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "Rick," he said the moment the line connected. "Walter?" The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, but with an unmistakable undertone of concern. "I wasn't expecting a call from you. What's going on?" "I need you to look into something for me," Walter said, his voice calm but firm. "The HOA just tried to evict me. No explanation that makes sense. No real justification. Something's not right." A pause. Then, Rick's voice came back, more serious now. "That doesn't sound legal. I'll pull the property records, see if there's any paperwork filed." "Do you have anything in writing?" "They sent letters," Walter said. "But nothing substantial. And now, suddenly, I have officers at my door telling me I have to leave." "That's not how this works," Rick muttered. "You own the property outright. They can't just force you out without due process." A pause. "Give me a few hours. I'll call you back." Walter hung up, his mind already working through the pieces. He had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that Karen didn't do anything without a reason. She didn't waste her time on people unless there was something in it for her. And the way she had spoken to him, the certainty in her voice, told him she had been planning this for a while. The real question was, why now? That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat in his chair, thinking, listening. He knew people often forgot that the world spoke in ways beyond sight. The way the wind carried sound, the way footsteps fell against pavement, the way tension vibrated in the air before something big happened. He had spent a lifetime attuned to those details, and right now, everything was telling him that this was bigger than a simple eviction. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Walter made a call to an old friend, a man who knew his way around digital records, someone who could dig deeper than any average lawyer. Within an hour, he had his answer. Karen wasn't trying to evict him because of HOA violations. She was trying to take his property for herself. Years ago, before Karen became the HOA president, her husband had been involved in a failed real estate deal, one that would have made him millions if it had gone through. At the time, Walter had been an early investor in the development of this very neighborhood. Unknowingly, his investment choices had prevented Karen's husband from securing the property he wanted. Walter had never given it a second thought. But Karen had. She had been waiting for years, biding her time, building her influence over the HOA. And now, she saw her chance. If she could get Walter out, she could seize his home, demolish it, and use the land to either build a luxury clubhouse or sell it to a developer for a massive profit. This wasn't about grass length or fence colors. This was personal. Walter exhaled slowly, pressing the phone to his ear as he called Rick back. "She's coming for my house, Rick," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then we're going to make sure she doesn't get it," Rick replied. Walter set the phone down and tightened his grip on his cane. If Karen wanted a fight, she had just picked the wrong man to push. The days that followed were a storm waiting to break. Walter knew Karen wouldn't back down, not after coming this far. She had spent years building her power in the HOA, manipulating homeowners into compliance, bullying them into silence. She wouldn't let one man, especially one she considered weak, unravel everything she had worked for. But what she failed to realize was that Walter wasn't weak. He was patient. He was calculating. And he was ready. Rick worked quickly. Within 48 hours, he had dug up a mountain of irregularities, a pattern of deception woven so deeply into the HOA's operations that it was astonishing Karen had gotten away with it for this long. The financial records were the first sign of trouble, hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into accounts that weren't HOA sanctioned, excessive violation fees charged to homeowners without any supporting evidence, and most damning of all, forged meeting minutes that made it seem as if the entire community had voted in favor of her policies when, in reality, they had never even been consulted. Walter listened as Rick explained the findings over the phone, his fingers pressing into the worn armrests of his chair. Karen had turned the HOA into her own personal empire, and for years, people had either been too afraid or too indifferent to fight back. She had forced homeowners to repaint their houses under threat of fines, bullied families into selling their properties by suffocating them with endless regulations, and pocketed the money from fabricated fees, all under the guise of protecting the neighborhood. But this time, she had made a mistake. She had come for the wrong house. As Walter absorbed the information, his phone buzzed with another call, his old friend, the one who had dug deeper into Karen's connections. The voice on the other end was tense, urgent. "Walter, I found something else. She filed a medical claim against you." The words sent a chill through him. "A what?" "A claim stating that you're mentally unfit to live alone. She's petitioning to have you placed in an assisted living facility." The rage that bubbled inside him was slow and steady, like lava building beneath the surface of a mountain ready to erupt. She wasn't just trying to take his home. She was trying to strip him of his autonomy. If she succeeded, she wouldn't even need an eviction order. She would have him declared incompetent, forcibly removed, and his property would be left wide open for her to seize. Walter gritted his teeth. She was trying to erase him. He had seen people like Karen before, power-hungry, manipulative, desperate to control everything around them. She had no idea who she was dealing with. That night, Walter sat in silence, his mind racing, formulating the next move. He had spent his life listening, observing, waiting for the right moment. And now, the moment had come. The next morning, just as the sun was creeping over the rooftops, a knock echoed through his house. A deliberate, heavy knock. Walter knew who it was before he even reached the door. Karen didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Walter, I assume you received the paperwork." Her voice carried the smoothness of someone who thought they had already won. "I'm giving you the chance to make this easy on yourself. We can arrange for a comfortable transition. I've spoken to the facility. They have a spot waiting for you." Walter tilted his head slightly, listening, not just to her words but to the subtle arrogance in her tone, the slight quickening of her breath. She was confident. Too confident. That meant she didn't know what he knew. "Funny," he said, his voice steady. "I spoke to my lawyer. Turns out filing fraudulent medical claims is a crime." Karen stiffened, but only for a second. "Walter, I'm only thinking of what's best for you." "That's generous of you," Walter said. "But we both know this isn't about my well-being. It's about control." Karen's mask slipped, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "You can fight this, but I have the backing of the HOA board. Do you really think you can take all of us on?" Walter smiled, slow and deliberate. "Karen, I don't need to fight all of you. I just need to turn the right people against you." For the first time, Karen hesitated. Walter let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words sink in. She wasn't invincible, and she was beginning to realize it. He could hear it in the slight shift of her feet, in the way her breath hitched just a little too quickly. Then, just as he had predicted, she pivoted. "If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate things," she warned. "You think you can just ignore the law?" Walter chuckled, the sound dry and amused. "That's exactly what I was about to ask you." Her jaw tightened. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stalked off his porch. But Walter knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat easily. If she had already resorted to fraud and blackmail, she wouldn't hesitate to push further. And she did. By that afternoon, Officer Mitchell and Officer Carter arrived at his doorstep again, their expressions uneasy. This time, their orders weren't just to serve an eviction notice. Karen had pulled them into her game. "We need to talk," Officer Mitchell said, his voice carefully measured. "Karen has filed an official report that you're refusing to comply with HOA directives. She claims your property is a safety hazard." Walter heard the reluctance in his tone, the hesitation. The officers were beginning to question what they were being told. Then, a third voice joined the conversation. "She also tried to bribe us," Officer Carter said flatly. Mitchell turned to him sharply, but Carter didn't waver. "She told us we'd be rewarded for ensuring the eviction happened quickly. And if we didn't cooperate, we'd regret it." Walter stood still, absorbing the shift. Karen was losing control, her desperation driving her to reckless decisions. She had overplayed her hand, and now the very people she had counted on were turning against her. The storm had broken. And now, it was time to strike. Walter had always believed that power, real power, wasn't in how loudly you spoke or how many rules you forced others to follow. It was in the quiet moments, the decisions made behind closed doors, the alliances built when no one was watching. Karen had spent years ruling through intimidation, making people afraid to speak, afraid to resist. But fear only worked for so long. And now, with her grip slipping, the cracks in her empire were beginning to show. It started with whispers. A neighbor, then two, then a dozen. People who had once nodded in silent compliance when Karen issued her decrees now began to ask questions. How had she gotten away with this for so long? Where had all the HOA funds really gone? Who had actually voted for the new restrictions that had made their lives miserable? One by one, the stories started pouring out. A single mother who had been fined thousands of dollars because her son had left a basketball on the driveway. An elderly couple forced to repaint their home twice in 1 year because the shade of beige they had chosen wasn't uniform. A disabled veteran who had been threatened with daily penalties for installing a wheelchair ramp that didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. And then, the story about Walter spread. The man who had never caused trouble, who had followed the rules, who had kept to himself, was now being thrown out of his own home for reasons that didn't make sense. That was the final crack that shattered the dam. People were angry, angrier than they had been in years. Because if it could happen to Walter, it could happen to any of them. And suddenly, they weren't afraid anymore. The next HOA meeting was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen, expecting her usual carefully controlled audience of compliant homeowners, was met with a packed room, neighbors who had never attended before, who had always stayed quiet, now standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices a low murmur of frustration and resentment. Karen, for the first time in years, looked uncertain. "Let's begin," she said, her voice sharp, forced into a semblance of control. "We have a lot to cover, and I expect everyone to." A voice cut through her command. "No, Karen," said a man near the front. "You don't get to control this meeting anymore." It was Officer Carter. He stood with his arms crossed, his badge catching the light as he spoke. "You're under investigation for fraud, abuse of power, and illegal eviction practices. There are reports of financial misconduct, falsified documents, and coercion against members of this community. You've been using your position to line your own pockets and intimidate people into submission. That ends today." The room erupted. Some people gasped, others muttered in agreement, and Karen's face went deathly pale. She looked to the other board members for support, but they all avoided her gaze. The silence of her allies spoke louder than any words. Walter sat quietly in the back, listening, feeling the energy in the room shift. The power Karen had wielded for years had never truly belonged to her. It had belonged to the people, to the community she had spent years oppressing. And now, they were taking it back. Karen slammed her gavel down, desperate to regain control. "This is nonsense. These accusations are baseless. I have always acted in the best interest of this community." A bitter laugh cut through the tension. A woman near the back, someone Walter recognized as the single mother Karen had harassed, stepped forward. "The best interest of the community," she repeated, shaking her head. "You stole money from us. You threatened people. You tried to force a blind man out of his home. And you call that leadership?" Karen's breath hitched, but before she could respond, the murmurs grew into shouts. More people stepped forward with their own stories, their own grievances, their own long-buried anger rising to the surface. Karen had ruled through silence, through submission, but now that silence had been broken. And then came the final blow. Rick, Walter's lawyer, entered the room, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. "Karen, I suggest you sit down," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Because as of this moment, there's a motion to remove you from your position, and enough evidence to press charges. The board has already been advised. You're finished." Karen's face twisted, cycling through shock, disbelief, rage. "You think you can do this to me?" she hissed. "I built this community. I made the rules." Walter finally spoke. "No, Karen. You just made people afraid to challenge them." The weight of the moment settled into the air like a final judgment. Karen had no more moves left, no more allies to lean on, no more threats to make. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to the people again. The fall of Karen wasn't swift, but it was absolute. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from her crimes, wasted no time in stripping her of her position. With the evidence piled against her, fraud, financial misconduct, abuse of power, there was no defense strong enough to save her. The legal process moved quickly, and within weeks, formal charges were filed. The same officers who once stood behind her on Walter's doorstep were now the ones escorting her away, her face pale as flashing cameras captured the moment she had never thought possible. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. Without Karen's oppressive grip, people no longer lived in fear of arbitrary fines or retaliatory actions. Homeowners who had once kept their heads down now spoke up, stepping forward to demand reforms. The HOA was restructured, its bylaws rewritten to ensure that no single person could ever seize control the way Karen had. Transparency became the new standard, and for the first time in years, the community functioned the way it was supposed to, a collective of voices, not a dictatorship. Walter, though never one to seek the spotlight, became a quiet symbol of resilience. He had fought, not just for his home, but for the dignity of everyone who had been bullied into silence. He stayed involved, attending meetings, advising on policies, ensuring that no one else would be targeted the way he had been. And when neighbors passed by his house, they no longer whispered in fear, they stopped to talk, to connect, to thank him for standing up when no one else had. Karen's downfall became a cautionary tale, not just within the neighborhood but beyond it. Her case was covered by local news, discussed in legal forums, and shared in homeowner groups across the country. She had believed she was untouchable, but in the end, all it took was one person refusing to back down for everything to come crashing down around her. As Walter sat on his porch one evening, listening to the sound of laughter from the park across the street, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The battle had been long, exhausting, but it had been worth it. His home was still his. His community was finally free. And Karen? She had become nothing more than a name people spoke of in past tense, a warning of what happened when power was abused. So now the question is, have you ever faced an HOA nightmare or a Karen who thought she ruled your neighborhood? Share your story below. Let's see who had it worse.